The Roman Empire is often glorified for its monumental achievements in law, architecture, governance, and military power. But hidden beneath the sheen of imperial glory were legal codes that were as bizarre as they were brutal. One of the most revealing aspects of Roman society is how differently it treated men and women, particularly in matters of sexual conduct. Adultery, for instance, was not just a personal scandal, it was a crime. But surprisingly, it was only considered criminal if committed by a married woman. This double standard was enshrined in law through the Lex Julia de Adulteriis Corsentis, introduced by Emperor Augustus in 18 BCE. This law was part of Augustus' broader moral reforms aimed at restoring traditional Roman values in a society that was increasingly seen as decadent and morally lax. According to this law, a woman caught committing adultery could face severe punishments. These included exile to a remote island, confiscation of property, and in some extreme cases, death. Even more chilling, if a woman was caught in the act by her husband or father, they were legally allowed to kill both her and her lover without consequence. The reasoning was simple yet stark. The integrity of the family, and most importantly, the legitimacy of the offspring, was considered vital to maintaining Roman social order. By contrast, married men were not held to the same standard. They could have affairs with prostitutes, concubines, and even slaves without facing legal penalties. The law was not concerned with male infidelity, as long as the man did not dishonor another Roman man by sleeping with his wife or daughter. This legal hypocrisy stemmed from the patriarchal framework of Roman society, where the male head of the household, the paterfamilias, had almost unlimited power over his family and its reputation. The very foundation of Roman law concerning morality rested on this deep-rooted gender bias. It wasn't just about infidelity, it was about control, status, and lineage. Roman men were entrusted with preserving their family name, honor, and property, while women were expected to be the vessels through which legitimate heirs were produced. Consequently, any breach of this expectation was not only a moral failing but a legal crime. The Roman courts were often involved in such cases, and public shaming was a routine part of the punishment. Trials for adultery could become major public spectacles, drawing crowds and headlines, not unlike the sensational trials we see in modern media. This law didn't just reflect societal values, it shaped them. Women lived under constant surveillance, knowing that their honor was tied not only to their own behavior but to the behavior of those around them. Mothers, sisters, and daughters had their reputations hanging by a thread, controlled by the ever-watchful eyes of their male guardians. In this way, Roman law created a gendered moral code that reinforced patriarchal authority and established a culture of fear and control. And this was just one law among many that governed the deeply hierarchical and often contradictory world of ancient Rome. While gender inequality in adultery laws was shocking, the treatment of slaves in Roman law was downright inhumane. Slaves were not considered people. They were property, legally referred to as res, things, objects, commodities. As such, they had no legal rights whatsoever. They could be bought, sold, punished, or even killed by their masters without any legal repercussions. The slave-owner relationship was not one of human interaction but one of absolute dominance. This legal foundation created a society where cruelty could flourish unchecked. One of the most terrifying legal decrees concerning slaves was the Senatus Consultum Silenianum, passed in 10 CE. This law mandated collective punishment of slaves. If a Roman master was murdered, all of the slaves under his roof, regardless of their involvement, were to be executed. The rationale was clear. Fear was to be the tool of control. Roman lawmakers believed that by threatening the entire household of slaves with death, they would deter any thoughts of rebellion or conspiracy. This law was put into horrifying practice in a case recorded by the historian Tacitus. After a Roman senator was murdered, 400 slaves from his household were rounded up and executed. This mass execution, carried out without regard to guilt or innocence, caused widespread outrage among Roman citizens. Yet, the law was upheld, and the executions proceeded. The punishments inflicted on slaves for even minor infractions were cruel beyond imagination. Whipping, branding, mutilation, and crucifixion were common. Crucifixion, in particular, was reserved for slaves or non-citizens who committed severe crimes like theft or murder. Unlike citizens who might be given a quick death, slaves were made to suffer in public displays of torture. Their pain was entertainment, a warning, and a statement of social order. Despite their suffering, there were rare voices that advocated for the humane treatment of slaves. One of these was the Stoic philosopher Seneca. In his letters, he urged fellow Romans to recognize the humanity in their slaves, calling them comrades and humble friends. But his calls were largely ignored. Roman law and society continued to treat slaves as subhuman, as tools for labor and objects of ownership. The legal structure surrounding slavery in ancient Rome reveals a society deeply invested in hierarchy, brutality, and fear. Slavery was not merely tolerated, it was institutionalized and protected by some of the harshest laws ever recorded. Every aspect of a slave's life, from their food and clothing to their relationships and movement, was dictated by the whims of their owners. The law supported this system fully, providing owners with the legal justification for acts that would be considered crimes in any modern society. These were not just laws, they were instruments of terror that maintained one of the most oppressive systems in ancient history. While the laws governing adultery and slavery were draconian, Roman legal views on birth, abortion, and child rearing were equally disturbing. In a society obsessed with lineage, status, and economic efficiency, children were seen as both a blessing and a burden. Abortion in ancient Rome was not only legal but, in many cases, encouraged. Particularly in the early stages of pregnancy, abortion was seen as a practical and acceptable means of birth control. There were no formal legal restrictions against it, and Roman physicians like Cyrenus wrote extensively about various methods to terminate pregnancy. Women, particularly those from poorer families, often resorted to abortion when a child would present an unmanageable financial or social burden. Wealthier women might undergo abortions to preserve their beauty or to avoid scandal. What's more, the male head of the household had the final say in reproductive matters. If a husband demanded that a pregnancy be terminated, the wife was expected to comply. The fetus was not considered a legal person until it was born and accepted by the paterfamilias. This gave Roman men immense power over life and death even before a child entered the world. But perhaps even more horrifying was the practice of expositio, the abandonment of unwanted newborns. It was common for parents, especially the poor, to leave infants in remote or public places, where they would either die from exposure or be picked up by strangers, often to be raised as slaves or prostitutes. Babies with visible deformities or those born out of wedlock were particularly vulnerable. There were no legal protections for these infants. In fact, exposure was considered a socially acceptable way to manage family resources. This practice also reflected the dark side of Roman pragmatism. Children were valued only if they could contribute to the household or preserve family legacy. Otherwise, they were discarded like broken tools. The emotional and psychological cost of this societal norm is incalculable, yet it was a regular part of Roman life. The law neither forbade nor condemned it. Instead, it turned a blind eye, effectively endorsing a system that denied the most basic rights to the most vulnerable. Even philosophers like Cicero and Pliny acknowledged the practice with either indifference or rationalization. The cold legal acceptance of abortion and infant exposure shows how Roman law could be ruthlessly utilitarian, placing practicality above humanity. The legal codes of ancient Rome didn't just control the living, they extended their reach into death. Among the strangest of these laws was the prohibition against burying individuals who had been struck by lightning. Rooted deeply in religious superstition, this law reflected the Roman belief that lightning was a direct expression of Jupiter's will. If someone died by lightning strike, their body was considered sacred, having been claimed by the king of gods. Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder wrote that such bodies were not to be moved or touched. They were to be left where they fell, or buried without ceremony at the same location. The idea was to avoid offending Jupiter further and to respect the divine judgment that had been passed. This law transformed a natural phenomenon into a legal and religious event, illustrating the deep entanglement of faith and law in Roman society. But even stranger was the pena cullae, the punishment for parricide, or killing one's father. In Roman eyes, this crime was so unnatural and abhorrent that it required a punishment equally shocking. Under this law, the convicted murderer was sewn into a leather sack along with 4 animals: a dog, a monkey, a rooster, and a viper. The symbolism was rich and disturbing. The dog represented betrayal, the monkey chaos, the rooster vigilance, and the viper treachery. Once the sack was sewn shut, it was thrown into a river, where the victim would drown in a frantic tangle of fur, feathers, fangs, and scales. This punishment was more than just execution, it was ritual. The combination of animals and the method of death reflected a belief in cosmic justice, a restoration of balance through symbolic means. Parricide was considered a disruption of the natural order, and so the punishment had to be equally unnatural. It was meant to terrify and to educate, to demonstrate the sacredness of the father's role in the household and society. Over time, this punishment became a public spectacle. Crowds gathered to witness the macabre ritual, reinforcing societal norms through fear and awe. Together, these laws paint a vivid picture of a society that valued order above compassion, control above equality, and tradition above reform. Roman legal codes were not only tools of governance but instruments of ideology, shaping a world where power and hierarchy dictated every aspect of life, and even death. You've just witnessed one of the darkest punishments in history. But many more still lurk in the shadows. So if you dare, subscribe to Torture Vault, where every scream from the past still echoes.